So good morning, everyone. Yeah, it's great to see you, and I hope some people will manage to join. Yeah, I think some people are coming in. Yeah, I hope you've managed to grab a cup of tea or coffee. So some of you might already know what Coffee for Thoughts is about, but let me just start very quickly saying that this is a part of this kind of small social innovation community that I call it with Elena Pesot from the University of Siena. And it's meant to be a space for kind of like short coffee break conversations with thinkers whose work really help us rethink institutions and everyday practices and the futures. So it's very informal, kind of idea-driven setting that invites, dialogue and reflection. But today's also conversation is also closely connected to my own research project called Atlantis, which has explored how scholars have been thinking about the present condition and future of universities. So I've already had the opportunity to speak with Ronald, and so I wanted to continue this conversation and follow up, and also felt important to kind of open it up so more people could engage and hear his work. So just a few words about Professor Ronald Barnett. He's one of the most thoughtful and influential philosophers of higher education of our time. So across several decades, his work has asked not only what universities do, but also what they are, what they ought to be, and what they might become. So he has written extensively on imagination, responsibility, the idea and reality of the university. And two of his key concepts are the ecological university and feasible utopias. And what makes his work really distinctive is that he doesn't separate philosophy from the realities of universities, the universities face. Um, Ronald, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today. Delighted have you with us. So maybe just begin with just kind of since we last spoke, which was last spring. It feels as though universities, especially in the US, have come to the spotlight. Nature just had a recent publication that says universities are caught in the eye of the storm. Facing different kinds of pressures, political and technological. And I wanted to hear your perspective. How does this moment feel surprising? Um, or is it just a continuation of dynamics that have already been underway?
Well, thank you very much, Kyriaki, and thank you all for being here today. It's a great pleasure and privilege to be here with you, and it's a joy to be given the space to share some of my thoughts. Like many academics, I'm very vain, and any opportunity I get to share my thoughts is great. Perhaps I just might start, though, before I come to the immediate question, and just share a quick reflection with everybody who may not know me or my work so well. For adult life, I was a bureaucrat in the academic world, but a bureaucrat nevertheless. I didn't get my first academic position until my mid-40s. Um, uh, but I've been doing a whole series of postgraduate qualifications, and I'd started to write for the literature, and my first book was coming out when I got my first job. And then when I got my first job, I was immediately asked to lead a major, or resuscitate, I should say, a master's course. And quickly my career shot off, and I soon found myself as a dean and part of the senior management team of my university. And then I became pro-director and responsible for longer-term strategy. And I've been ducking and diving with many national and international policy-oriented institutions. Why do I say all of that? Because my life has been ducking and diving between theory stroke philosophy on the one hand and practice and policy on the other hand. I've worn the scars. I still have the scars of many of those practical and policy battles I've been involved in. I won't go over it all, but I was right in the thick, for example, of the student revolution as a bureaucrat in 1968. Um, uh, and so I've been in the world of practice, and I've been absolutely fascinated by the way in which there is or should be a dialogue between our efforts as theoreticians and philosophers on the one hand, and those in the field of policy and practice on the other. So all my work, two things, all my work, first of all, has been autobiography. It might look very abstract and philosophical to many people, but it's actually a space in which I've tried to work out the angst of professional and practical and policy life. So that's the first thing to be said. And secondly, in my writing, I hope any of you who have seen it have a sense that I'm wrestling with practical matters in my writing. And so you will often see at the end of a paragraph or on a page, you will see some reference to some practical or policy matter. I'm trying all the time to engage the reader who's in the policy and practical field. Most of our readers, by the way, are practitioners. They're not philosophers, and we've got to reach out to them. And secondly, it seems to me that there's something of a professional, an academic, and intellectual responsibility here for those of us who are privileged to work in the field of education to try to reach out to practitioners and those in the practical and policy fields. So anyway, that's just a little bit of background about me and about how I've come at my intellectual work over the last several decades. Well, I hope that's of some help.
Yeah.
And by the way, I'm conscious that not everybody here on this call has been gripped, as I have, by matters about higher education in university. And you may be interested in wider matters of institutional innovation. And that's all to the good, because I hope that some of my reflections in my
Mm.
work do have that wider payoff. I've been told that they do, and I hope you will sense that and see that. I'm trying to raise broad issues, and here I come directly to the matter that Kyriaki has just posed to me. I'm trying to pose broad issues of institutional challenge and
Mm.
institutional development and innovation, albeit from a philosophical and theoretical point of view. So let me come then directly to the question that Kyriaki has just raised. It is the current set of crises, and it's a term that's being used regularly these days, is the current set of crises, is it new or is it just a continuation of the past? And the answer, of course, is both. Um,
Mm.
the literature over the last 60 years on higher education and in public services generally has been one of challenge, difficulty, um, and so forth. Challenges coming especially from a rejigging of the public sector by the state to enlist the public sector in its own enterprises and its own strategies. And so from about the 1970 onwards, we had much talk about neoliberalism and so on and so forth. And we had talk of the knowledge economy that goes back several decades. And all of that is still lurking there, but it has been compounded over the last few years in one or two ways. First of all, we've had the emergence of the digital era, and that is changing daily. And in the last, what, 5 to 8 years, we've had the emergence of artificial intelligence.
Mhm.
And all of that is imposing huge challenges, practical, technological, ethical, pedagogical, institutional, managerial, administrative, on higher education and other public sector organizations as well. Secondly, because higher education has merged, and this point is so obvious, but it's not actually normally noticed, because higher education has taken on the form of mass higher education, we now have a situation that I call in my writing the 50% problem. It was actually quite nice when only 5% went to higher education. You knew where you were. Very few people in higher education knew anything about universities, and that didn't matter. But now you have 50% going into higher education. It matters profoundly. Why? Not because of the 50% who are going into higher education, but because of the 50% who are not going into higher education. So now you have a society which is cleaved into two. People who have experienced higher education and people who have not experienced higher education. And there's empirical evidence developing about the number of times people who in a community, say, and have one or two major universities in their midst, who never ever go onto the campuses of those universities. To them, the university is there down the road. They've got no idea as to what this strange institution is. It's a foreign entity. It's a strange entity. It's a rather terrifying entity. And so we have massive challenges then in society as to the relationship between universities and society, what the society owes the university and what university owes society. And you see this has developed into massive tensions all across the world. Um, so that's a second thing. And these compound together because you then get massive challenges as to obviously on as to how you finance higher education is you hear a lot of bleating on the part of academics about higher education being a public good. It's never cashed out as to what that means, by the way. What do we mean by higher education as a public good? It's just trotted out as a simplistically, ritualistically, as if we all knew what it meant. Um, uh, and I've always found that claim utterly spurious because, by and large, academics have not acted in the public interest at all. They speak in an arcane language to
Mhm.
themselves, and academics is, in most disciplines are writing for about 400 or 500 people around the world. That's
Yes.
it. And that's the world they live in. So it's not surprising there are tensions between society and the university. But all of this, as I say, compounds. We have broader political challenges and changes going on in the world. We have shifts between the left and the right. We see oscillations of quite violent nature. We see only yesterday a new right-wing government having been voted into Chile, and you see these oscillations going on around the world, and you see in response students responding in acts of public disobedience, you might say, student activism on the streets going on around the world. So, uh, and well, we don't need to go into that, but I think there are explanations as to why we're seeing these extreme movements left and right across the world today. But the university is caught up in all of this. Now, the further question is, uh, as in terms of the broad issue of innovation in the public sector, as to whether or not there's anything distinctive about universities, as say compared to the health sector. Well, there is.
Mhm.
Universities are extraordinary places because universities are in the in as it were broad supposition as to what they're all about. They're uncanny places uh, because they are institutions for the furthering not just of dissent, but the furthering of antagonism. That is to say, they are institutions which are intended to call forth dispute. If there was no dispute, there would be no academic literature. The whole point of academic literature is to generate disputatious processes. He says this and she says the other. She said that and I don't agree with it, and so on and so forth. And that's how academic life proceeds. But that's an extraordinary human institution. There's nothing else like it. You might point to newspapers and so on and so forth, but most newspapers have their own positions. The
Mm,
university does not have its own position, by and large, by and large. So there are really very, very interesting issues about universities, not least in 21st century. And that phrase needs to be added, the 21st century. Universities are supposed to be spaces for opening conversation, for widening conversation, for include more and more perspectives, frameworks, theories. Let it all come forward. Let us all debate together.
mm,
But over the 20th century and running into the 21st century, over the last 50, 60 years, we've seen gradually a closing of the university space in all sorts of ways because of its expense, because of its riskiness, its challenging nature. States have sought to close down the space in which universities operate. And you see this all over the world, not just in the so-called developing or world or global north. You see it all over the world, in the global south and in the global north. So universities, quotes, have come under attack, and they're having to work out uh, their position in this circumstance, made, as I say, all the more difficult by the circulation of information, tropes, and so forth on the internet. And for example, over the last few years has developed in the public domain a debate as to whether or not universities can or should be neutral.
mhm,
Whether or not universities can or should be neutral. Is it a responsibility of vice chancellors and presidents of universities to speak out publicly if they think that things are going awry and that the state is acting in deleterious ways in relation to the university sector? And there are mixed views about this
mm,
amongst presidents and vice chancellors, and for understandable reasons. We see what happens if sometimes if they do speak out. So there are grave issues here, and of course, this impacts on the thorny issue of institutional autonomy and academic freedom. Very interesting to see how that debate, which has been rumbling on now for 150 years or more, has intensified over the last few years. By the way, those two concepts are very important and they need to be distinguished. Institutional autonomy on the one hand and academic freedom on the other. And there's not
mhm.
enough recognition of their distinctiveness and the difficulties of their relationship. Do you need academic autonomy? Do you need institutional autonomy for academic freedom? And does academic freedom need institutional autonomy? Very interesting philosophical and theoretical questions, which we won't go into here and now. But the answer to my question, to Kyriaki's question is, yes, this is a continuation, but there are a whole raft of new matters which have come onto the scene, even in the past 20 years or so, which are intensifying the difficulties that universities are facing.
Thank you so much this for a very, very elaborate answer. Very, very interesting, everything you've raised. I love talking to you because I don't need to prompt you. Like you just answer everything very, very eloquently. Um, so one of there are two ideas in your writing that I have highlighted, especially as hopeful in ways of looking forward or tackling the challenges we currently or universities face. And those are the ecological university and also the idea of feasible utopias. So I was wondering if you could say a little bit about these ideas because I think some of people in this group might not have heard them, and say how they might allow us to see differently universities today.
Thank you. Well, th these two ideas of the ecological university and feasible utopia build on what I've just been saying in every sense. So they are matters of autobiography. Um, uh, Precisely because I have been ducking and diving in policy and practical and institutional fields, uh, they are a reflection of how I've come to understand the nature of universities theoretically. Um, to put it crudely and grandly and very technically, universities are in a messy situation. How about that? But what does that mean? We need to unpack that. Of course, the Marxists go on, and there are friends in Poland who write these books still today, um, go on talking about higher education and the economy. And that's very important. It's crucially important. But it's evident from what I've been saying that higher education is caught in a web, both with the economy on the one hand and the state on the other. So we've got, as it were, two circles around the
Mm,
university straight away. But of course, the university is part of and an engine for the rise and development of the global knowledge ecosystem. And this is an extraordinary feature of the contemporary world. It's really only developed massively since the Second World War. The presence of knowledge as a global system, whereby academics and of course aided by the digital revolution, academics can talk to each other, do talk to each other in all sorts of ways straight away. So, and communities are developed across the world, as is often said. People would rather talk to somebody on the other side of the world than talk to their neighbour in the corridor or in the room next door. Um, uh, because of the way in which academic communities, plural, have been formed. So there's a massive and complex knowledge ecosystem. But then one goes on recognizing that, of course, the university is ducking and diving with other ecosystems. And I started off with 7 ecosystems, and now I'm up to 10. I don't know if I can remember them all off the top of my head, but this is a fact of the matter. You've only got to think of the different ways in which the university is ducking and diving with the wider world. So let's see if I can remember those 10 quickly off the top of my head. And I start and in one of my recent books, I distinguish between ecosystems of the interior, which are more organically connected with the university as such, and ecosystems of the exterior, where the university is responding to and connecting with the wider world. Let's see if I can remember them quickly. The ecosystems of the interior are those of knowledge, learning, subjectivity or each individual seen as an ecosystem, and culture. By the way, when I was young, the linking of the term university and culture was very comfortable and seen continuously. We've lost all of that. That, by the way, I'm so old. I remember the 1963 massive Robbins report into UK higher education, where 4 aims of higher education were identified, and one of those aims was the was to was the understanding that universities were a vehicle for the promotion of a common culture, and that
mm,
was one of 4 aims in a massive uh, state report on higher education, which had 20 volumes of evidence. So it wasn't a trivial matter at all. And there you had an identification of the university with culture. Anyway, so we've got already got knowledge, learning, individuals, and culture. So those are the four of the interior. Then I had four of the exterior. Social institutions, call it society, the economy, um, uh, let me just think, nature, and the state. Okay. So, uh, and of course, nature has come onto the scene in the last, what, 30, 40 years, but increasingly over perhaps the last 20 years. And you see it in the United Nations Sustainability Development Goals. By the way, those Sustainability Development Goals haven't got much to do with the sustainability of nature, but that passed. Um, uh, I've got up to eight, but I've added two recently, and those two are inevitably, from what I've been saying, they are uh, the digital uh, ecosystem uh, fueled recently by AI, and all
Mm,
universities are bound up in that in all sorts of intricate ways that we don't understand. They're not only recipients of AI, they are creators of AI. So
mhm,
they're doubly implicated there. But then you've also got the law. And all across the world, universities are being are being entangled into the legal apparition of society at all sorts of levels. You've only got to think, for example, of quality evaluation. Normally, these are conducted by instruments and institutions of the state and are backed up by law. But of course, you see the ways in which the state is imposing the law on universities in all sorts of ways, and a minor profession uh, of lawyers interested in higher education has developed over the last 30 or 40 years. So you've got 10 ecosystems, and I've tried to depict these in diagrams in my two recent books on the ecological university, um, and uh, and you get into a very nice uh, 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 aesthetic challenge of trying to depict 10 or as it was 8 circles in and around the university. They're outside the university, they're inside the university. They're all in motion. They're all in motion with each other. They're working with each other, against each other. So you've got very intricate relationships and connections going on all at once. This is a world in motion, and the university is in it and is part of it and is fueling much of this. It's not just a passive recipient of all of this. The university itself is creating disturbance and destabilization in society, and quite rightly too. But anyway, that so when I talk about the ecological university, could have called it the ecosystem university. That would have
mhm,
sounded rather precious and
mhm,
cumbersome. So I called it the ecological university. But it isn't. You see there that nature is just one of 10 ecosystems. More than that, in my book where I, I traced the ecological university, then I just had 8 ecosystems. I put nature last. And somebody said, why have you put nature last? Surely it should be first. On the
mhm,
contrary, I put nature last because we only understand human relationships with nature through the other ecosystems. Nature is in the mess it's in because all the other ecosystems have gone awry. And if we're going to sort out our relationships with nature, we have to come at it through sorting out our relationships with society, with individuals, with knowledge, with learning, and so on and so forth. It's not as it were a matter in itself that we can deal with in itself, in its own right. So that's the ecological university. But then going on to the other matter that Kyriaki raises about feasible utopia, academics all the time holding up their hands in horror about the crises of the university and the terrible plight it's in, being undermined, and so on and so forth. Yes, of course. But the extraordinary thing is that this unstable situation that I'm trying to understand and analyze is actually creating new spaces for the university.
Mm,
That's my sense. And the university doesn't yet understand the spaces that it has available to it. If the world is really turbulent, as I'm saying, and the universities itself are contributing to this turbulence, A, it has responsibilities in the matter, but it also has possibilities in the matter. So these two concepts of responsibility and possibility are absolutely fundamental to my idea of the ecological university and and the matter of feasible utopia. What does feasible utopia mean? It means precisely what it says on the tin. It means we can envisage new worlds, new ways of going on for the university, but they have to be anchored in a serious analysis of the way in which the university is in the world. So, to put it in critical realist terms, ontology has to precede epistemology. We have to understand the nature and the character and the difficulties of the world. And I take it from critical realism that the world is ontologically layered and much of
mm,
it is hidden, is invisible, and is will always be unknown to us. But nevertheless, we can dimly sense, even from what I've said already, that there are ontological layers to the world, which the university itself is contributing to, and is adding to the sediments of and layers, ontological layers of which have come to produce the world that we're in. I mean, for example, the very concept of the Anthropocene, the way
mm,
in which humanity has changed literally the surface of the earth, not only the surface of the earth, but the oceans of the world and the atmosphere immediately above. Much of that has come about because of the technologies and the learning and the knowledge that universities have generated. So the university is not immune, not is implicated in all of this. But that said, if the university is implicated, is a player, is an actor in all of this, then the university has possibilities to do other things. Now,
mm,
I'm a realist. And I've tried to offer ideas as to how the university can, as it were, move forward in this difficult world. But precisely because the world is difficult, and there are massive, massive forces at work in the economy, in the state, which are imposing themselves on universities, the university is constrained. But while being constrained, it also has possibilities. So it's our responsibility as creative intellectuals to work out what is possible, what is feasible. I want us to be utopian, but I want
mm.
our utopian thinking to be feasible.
This is very very powerful and very relevant to my Atlantis project because there I'm using Francis Bacon utopian as the background of thinking about the future of universities. But you said many things that that I find very interesting, and there are questions to follow up. First, I was wondering if you thought that this there's some deeper philosophical or even like political ideas that um, kind of shape the ecosystem or the way that different elements move around. Like, are there, um, for example, like neoliberalism? You know, does that is that a force that positions the 10 elements in a certain way versus other forces? Are there kind of bigger philosophical ideas or trends that you think that um, that control the way the ecosystem falls into place?
Yeah. Well,
Um,
thank you. It's a very important question, Kyriake. And what I say is that the ecosystems in which the university is entangled have differential levels of force and effect. And of the 10 ecosystems that I've identified, I would say that the state, the economy, and now you'd have to add AI and the digital revolution are the three
Mhm.
most powerful. So
Yeah.
the question then becomes as to what leverage the other ecosystems have and what leverage the university has to use its relationships with the other ecosystems, with individuals, with learning, with knowledge, with culture, with society, with local communities, what leverage the university has with those other ecosystems in order to dent
Mm.
the worst effects of those other three dominant ecosystems. And that has to be worked out in a very painstaking way. For those of us who have ever tried to write the corporate strategy of a university, as I have done, it's a jolly difficult matter. I mean, academics are very sniffy about administrators, but I invite them to try and be an administrator for a week. It's jolly
Mm.
difficult stuff, I can tell you. And sitting down in front of a computer with a blank screen in front of you and a cursor blinking at you, demanding words for the first draft of a university corporate strategy is no easy task.
Yeah.
What is a university today in the 21st century? Universities, most of them, like to have a paragraph about their ethical position early on in their mission statement or their corporate strategy. Well, what does that mean? What does it mean for a university to have an ethical position? And many of them, particularly in the global south, are heavily, seriously involved in trying to bring in indigenous communities and reach out to the impoverished and so forth in their regions in a quite extraordinary way sometimes. Many of them are, as it were, at the sharp end of very difficult political and economic matters. But that only goes to show that universities do have some room for maneuver. We shouldn't be over romantic about this.
Yeah.
The forces that are at work are hugely powerful. The owners of the Californian uh, uh,
State University.
artificial intelligence engines are not going to divulge the basis on which they have erected their logarithms, and
Mm.
uh, and and uh, and they want to remain opaque, and they will remain opaque. So, just by the way, little aside, I've been very interested in the matter of critical thinking. I wrote a book on critical thinking some years ago, and I've gone back to the matter now, and I'm working on a new book on critical thinking. Why? Because critical thinking is now in an even more difficult position than it was decades ago. But there's serious matter there, and it's reflected in that. If you look at the empirical evidence, whereas 20, 30, 40 years ago, universities would have signed up to the whole venture of critical thinking as a pedagogical interest. Now it's hardly to be seen at all, would you believe, in universities' websites. So the way in which universities understand themselves and project themselves and the values that they want to enunciate and take forward is a very serious matter these days. So
Yeah.
so there's a whole raft of matters there in front of universities in working out the space they have, working out how they're going to engage with the spaces that they have, and what are the ethical base on which they're going to do so. And all of that is very tricky stuff.
Mm.
If there are 10 ecosystems, major ecosystems, you might identify others. That doesn't disarm me at all. There may well be others, major ecosystems that university has to grapple with and be alert to. But then working out a feasible utopia in relation to the huge powers that there are circulating around in the state, in the economy, in artificial intelligence requires great powers of analysis and an imagination and political nous. What can
Mm.
we say? What can't we say? How are we going to describe what we're going to do? What practices are available? What should pedagogy mean in the 21st century under these conditions?
Mm.
There are all sorts of ideas swirling around, but we need to anchor our ideas against, as I say, an understanding of the situation that we're in.
Yeah. I know you haven't, I mean, I'm very excited to hear that you're working or thinking about, you haven't written anything directly about AI, no, so far yourself, or I feel like you're thinking about it.
Yeah. Yes. I've dabbled a bit. I've got maybe one or two sorties in blogs and so forth, and I've got a co-edited book on the way. It's becoming so complicated and it's moving so quickly. I'm hesitant to try and write anything at great length. I've written, the odd few hundred words here and there on various collaborative ventures and blogs and so forth, because it's something that really concerns me. I'd be happy to say a few things about that if that was helpful.
Yeah, please do. And I know that we always run out of time, but I also invite, I don't know, Elena, Johan, anyone who wants to raise any questions to do that. Um, but maybe I think everyone would probably be interested to hear your thoughts about AI.
Okay. Well, the first thing to be said is that AI is injurious to life on this planet. Simple as that. We're in a very difficult situation on this little planet we call Earth. We have ruined the Earth in all sorts of ways, as I was saying earlier. How are we going to get out of this mess? We can only get out of it by having more and more ideas of permitting and encouraging dissent, dispute,
Mm,
competing ideas, competing perspectives. And why do I say that? Because artificial intelligence runs us precisely in the opposite direction. It is presenting us with a diminution of the cognitive capital of humanity. So I should say that again. Artificial intelligence is presenting us with a diminution of the cognitive capital of humanity.
mm,
And I could go into that and say more. But there are all sorts of technical issues about hallucinations and honesty and trust and so forth. That, by the way, is another serious matter which I was alert to when it all started. I thought, gosh, it's going to presage the end of trust in society. And you see that straight away. And it came up yesterday in something my partner and I were looking at, where we had an email come to us separately. And I thought it was a scam. And I immediately hit the delete button. But my partner looked into it and came back to me and said, no, it's not a scam. But that is a nice indication of the situation we're now in. We are
mm.
mistrusting those things that should be trusted, and we are trusting those things that should not be trusted.
Yeah.
And this is absolutely indicative of the breakdown of trust that artificial intelligence is leading to. It's an extraordinary situation. But that, by the way, that although that heralds the end of society, because society depends on trust, humans trusting each other when they meet each other in the street and they have a conversation, you trusting that what you're hearing coming out of the mouth of the person you're talking to on the pavement is their thoughts, their ideas. But we can no longer believe that that is the case. Quite apart from many texts and images we see on the screen or wherever. But this other matter that I wanted to draw attention to, the depletion of the cognitive resources of humanity, uh, I regard as the most fundamental and serious matter. You've only got to gross it up. What we're
Mm,
seeing are is the ownership of forms of communication in the hands of a very few. Uh, you're all far too young, even I'm a little bit too young to remember the 1930s and Goebbels and he was the communication czar of Hitler. But imagine if somebody like Goebbels had artificial intelligence at his disposal. I mean, it was bad enough anyway. You think of what happens in various regimes now across the world, uh, and think where this can go. We are seeing
Yeah.
the closing of spaces for thought and for dispute across the world. And universities are part of this. They are signing up. I can't understand university. Well, you can, of course, because of the powers that are acting on. But they're grappling hold of, or they're signing up to, they're acquiescing to these technologies of over which they have no control. Isn't that absolutely bizarre and amazing?
Yeah,
And they're
yeah.
subjecting students to these technologies over which they have no control. And then they're telling the students, well, in the best of them, in some elite universities where such strange activities still go on, they're telling their students they've got to be critical. How the heck can you be critical of something over which you have no control and no understanding?
Mm.
So anyway, I've got a bit off track there, but I'm losing my thread. So you'll have to help me carry on.
Yeah, no, I think Johan has a question. So let's see. I mean, this is all fascinating.
Yes, I do. Thank you. I really do think maybe I can get us back on track, but there is a good thread. I feel a little bit responsible actually for what the digitalization has done to the world, because I've been working in the telecoms industry at Ericsson. So I'm a practitioner in the beginning, but also the product of Lund University, moving here to study and stayed, impacting the world with 2G, 3G, 4G, 5G, now 6G, connecting everything. Of course, nobody knew what the outcome would be when we started. But I've also worked to institutionalize innovation in large companies like Tetra Pak. So building the innovation management model to both, let's say, become more efficient, but also to, let's say, get a common language and be able to speak to universities at all, because the planning horizons are so different. And since 14 years, I've been writing the standard ISO 56000 innovation management system requirements that we published last year. So we do sort of have a common ground for an ontology that could be layered and maybe managed. So, but my question, I'll come to it right now. I'm now humbly uh, um, grateful for being hired at the university again without any PhD. So I'm back after 30 years to create a platform, a sort of a test bed, making the campus a test bed for the data collection that we can do together. And hopefully that will address partially the divide between what we perceive as academia and industry. And my question is related to this because we see in Sweden, we do feel privileged to have, let's say, many exceptions to as to how we can um, operate. And but my question to you, Ron, is do you see a difference after having listened to you? I'm delighted to hear it. But do you also see a difference between the publicly funded universities and the private funded universities? You say, are there pros and cons here, or do you see different developments going into the age of AI?
Well, it's a nice question. It's a nice MBA question. What is the difference between private and public universities? And the answer, of course, is increasingly there isn't a difference. States around the world have funded so-called private universities. That, in other words, they continue to invest in so-called private universities. And so-called public universities have been left to fend for themselves in the open private market. And increasingly in states around the world, um, private universities will take great pleasure and pride in claiming that they have a public role to play. And public universities take great pride in proclaiming their entrepreneurial and enterprising abilities. So increasingly, there's very little in uh, the distinction between public and private universities. And in fact, there's a nice sort of academic game to be played here, and you see it playing out in the literature as to what we mean by, quotes, public university. Is it just a matter of receipt of taxpayers' money, or is it much broader than that? Do public universities have, as it were, ethical responsibilities which perhaps private universities don't have? And that debate rumbles on in the literature.
Mm.
I wouldn't want to invest any great weight on that distinction. And indeed, so far as, for example, America is concerned, very few people outside of America, and perhaps even inside America, understand the difference between so-called public and private universities. To most people, even in America, universities are just universities, and they wouldn't know that some universities are so-called private and some are so-called public. So at the margin, of course, there are differences, but you see both private and public universities figuring in the world league tables and that in the world rankings, and that of there's no differentiation made there in world rankings between public and private. In fact, I've never now you're prompting me to make this remark that I've never seen that distinction made, public and private, in the presentation of any world ranking.
Mm.
So you've got no idea as you look at a world ranking whether you're looking at private or public universities or whatever. As I say, nowadays they're very much swimming in each other's territory. So there you are. But it is a nice question as to whether, and a philosophical question as to whether or not those uh, universities that are directly in receipt of public monies, public taxpayer monies, um, and are largely funded on the basis of public taxpayer monies, whether or not they do have ethical responsibilities of a kind that perhaps private universities do not have. As I say, it plays out in very interesting ways. I mean, if you take um, uh, uh, San Francisco, is it San Francisco, where you have both Berkeley on the one hand and Stanford on the other, almost next to each other. One's public and one's private. Very interesting to look at their modus operandi, how they actually relate to the world. And it'd be, I think it'd be a lovely sort of empirical study to go into them and look at how they relate to, for example, their regions, as to whether or not, to the extent to which each is playing, as it were, a public role
Mm.
in circulating their knowledges, engaging with local communities, and so on and so forth. I think there are differences at the margin, even now, but it's not much more than that.
Mm.
Thank
Well,
you.
we've again, time just passes when we talk to you, Ronald. It's just so fascinating to hear your thoughts. I personally hope that in your critical thinking book, you can address what you say about the diminution of the cognitive capital of humanity. Is that in relation to AI? I think that could be a nice space to continue, or for us to maybe keep looking for your thoughts, the evolution of your thinking about AI, and maybe just. I feel like one of the challenges today is that with the current trends, the humanities are being closed down. So I feel like reasserting the need for like critical thinking and making more obvious the effect of AI in our education, that would be very important.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly.
any final thoughts, Ronald, from you to leave us with?
Not really. Carrie, okay, you in your have very helpful email to me. You identified a number of questions, and we haven't been able to have time. I'm afraid I speak too much. I speak too much to greater length. But you raise, for example, the matter as to the concept of praxis,
Mm,
and just to say that for me, I've always been troubled by this concept, and so I did wrestle with it in one of my books, and I identified 8 strands to the concept of praxis. And that it's a lovely concept because it directly links, going back to my very first opening reflections, it links theory and reflection on the
mm,
one hand with practice on the other, in all sorts of very interesting ways. And it's a very difficult concept, but it's one that I think is can be helpful to us. And it forces, if it's taken seriously, it forces theorists to think about practical implications, and expose the relationships between practice and reflection. And just quickly on the last point you've just made about the humanities, it's a matter that's dear to my heart. I've been writing on and off about the fate of the humanities. By the way, the crisis in the humanities isn't new. I know exactly where it is. It's just at the end of my arm as I reach out here. Got a little paperback there. It's called The Crisis in the Humanities. It's dated 1966. So this matter has been with us for some time. The humanities are dying, but they are a long time a dying, and
mm.
they keep going. And that is an interesting question. Why are they still going? Not why are they being diminished, but how is it that they are still going in a technological age? So that these are very interesting matters that perhaps we might come back to on another time.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you again for finding the time to speak to us. I know this is the last days before Christmas break, so I want to wish you all a wonderful Christmas or holiday season. And yeah, let's continue our conversation. Good luck
Okay.
with all the writing and all the edited books and series that you have. And yeah, we'll stay in touch.